Section 2. Art and the Plague. Representing the bubonic plague in early modern Europe. In art history, the era spanning from approximately the 14th through the 16th centuries in Europe is typically classified as the Renaissance, an artistic period associated with the rebirth of classical ideas and the rise of humanism. The era was accompanied by a greater interest in naturalism and the development of linear perspective. Economic prosperity and the rise of global trade helped foster the arts and spread aesthetic philosophies. But the Renaissance was also a tumultuous time for Europe, characterized by repeated outbreaks of pestilence dating back to 1347, when the Black Death, likely the bubonic plague, was brought to Sicily on a Genoese ship. The plague spread was rapid and devastating. By 1351, when the first wave of the disease began to subside, anywhere from 25 to 60% of the population of Europe had perished, with 33% being the most common estimate. Scholarly accounts vary, but contemporary estimates suggest anywhere from 75 to 200 million people died in Europe and Asia. Cities in particular, where people lived in close proximity and lacked modern sanitation protocols, became the focal points of the pandemic. Outbreaks of plague continued to recur into the early 18th century, and it took 2 centuries for the world population to recover its pre-1347 level. During this period, little was known about how disease was spread. One popularly held belief was that bad air or bad smells were to blame. This is now known as the miasma theory. Medical advice at the time instructed people to carry pleasant fragrances with them to combat the contaminated air and avoid illness. Wealthy Florentine citizens tucked sachets of fragrance into their clothing or tied perfumed bottles to their belts. Nicholas Poisson's 1631 painting, The Plague of Ashdod, shows a man holding his nose as he crosses a street, laden with the bodies of plague victims. Such efforts were fruitless in the face of the epidemic. In fact, it was rats carrying infected fleas that spread the disease through trading vessels. The fleas would jump from rats to human carriers. It was thought that the outbreak began in Central Asia and was brought westward through the trade routes of the Silk Road. Because the initial impact was so destructive and subsequent outbreaks were a regular occurrence for much of the Renaissance, Europeans were constantly either coping with the affliction, recovering from it, or anticipating its return. It should come as no surprise that the Black Death informed the cultural production of the time, whether as a means of coming to terms with death or as an apotropaic symbol to ward off infection. Death induced by plague was horrible. Most victims died within 2 to 7 days of the appearance of their initial symptoms. The illness typically began with fever and flu-like symptoms. Victims suffered as swollen glands, pustules, abscesses, and boils erupted over their bodies. Some vomited blood or developed rashes or black spots on the skin. The Florentine author Boccaccio was an important primary source for describing the outbreak as he witnessed it. In his book, The Decameron, he imagines 10 young people telling tales to one another as they attempt to escape the plague by sheltering in a villa outside Florence. He wrote, "Whether through the operation of the heavenly bodies or because of our own iniquities, which the just wrath of God sought to correct, the plague had arisen in the East some years before, causing the death of countless human beings." Some scholars suggest that the decimation of Europe's population led to greater fluidity. One notable example of this was the Medici family, who moved from rural Tuscany to Florence after the deadliest wave of the plague, when the deaths of many prominent Florentine families left a power vacuum that the wealthy banking families was able to fill. The medics would become the most powerful art patrons of the era. Art commissions also rose in the aftermath of the Black Death, as survivors sought to either commemorate loved ones or buy protection from illness by commissioning artworks for their local churches. While representations of people in the midst of suffering from the plague are relatively rare, and some medieval illustrations once identified as plague victims are now thought to be suffering from leprosy, paintings, prints, and murals that document the Black Death's devastation by depicting the dead are widespread. As early as 1348, there was a published account of the plague's impact in Tournai by Gilles Le Muisis, which was accompanied by a painted miniature showing a crowd carrying coffins of all sizes for burial. Some saw the plague as a sort of divine punishment for mankind's sins, and the Catholic Church and Church Commission art placed an emphasis on repentance in anticipation of God's final judgment. Selected work: Pieter Bruegel, the Elder, The Triumph of Death, c. 1562. Pieter Bruegel, the Elder, biography. Pieter Bruegel, the Elder, was the best-known member of a prominent family of painters in the Netherlands. Born around 1525, the artist died just 7 years after he painted The Triumph of Death. He was likely born in Breda, but later settled in Antwerp, a commercially vibrant city and center for publishing in what was then known as the Netherlands, or Flanders, but is now Belgium. At some point between 1551 and 1552, he became a master in the Painters' Guild of St. Luke, and shortly thereafter began traveling in Italy. By 1555, the artist reached Rome, where he studied with the miniaturist Giulio Clovio. He also visited Naples and spent time in the Alps before returning to Antwerp in 1554. The following year, he began a business arrangement with the artist and publisher Hieronymus Koch, with Bruegel providing Koch with designs for prints. Bruegel remained in Antwerp, participating in the humanist social scene there until 1563, at which point he married Maken Koek and moved to Brussels, where he lived until his death in 1569. His descendants, Pieter Bruegel the Younger and Jan Bruegel the Elder, were artists as well. While his sons used Bruegel as a surname, Bruegel dropped the H from his name in 1559, possibly in an attempt to Latinize it, giving his interest in Italy and humanism, and signed all subsequent work as Bruegel. Bruegel acquired the nickname Peasant Bruegel because so many of his works focused on the lives of the common people of Flanders, a theme that was quite rare at the time. While he did some religious painting as well, Bruegel's best-known works feature peasants and village life set within naturalistic landscapes. His work is distinguished by his eye for detail, attention to local settings, and thoughtfully composed arrangements of form. Subject matter and visual analysis. Bruegel's paintings often incorporate high horizon lines, as in The Harvesters, a large-scale painting that was part of a commissioned series depicting the changing seasons. In his presentation of a group of laborers taking a break from reaping the late summer harvest, he brings humanity to the individual workers while also giving attention to the rolling Netherlandish countryside. In contrast, The Triumph of Death employs a much darker tone. Here, in the same compositional technique of using a high horizon line, enables the artist to produce a panoramic view of an apocalyptic landscape. His painting emphasizes the indiscriminate nature of mortality, death, whether as a result of illness, famine, or war, was ever present in this era. Most commissioned artworks in Bruegel's time were religious in nature. Themes that encouraged viewers to repent because death was coming for all were extremely popular. In The Triumph of Death, morbid and nightmarish smoke and burned fires can be seen in the reddish ochre background, while two shipwrecks are visible in the distant sea. The foreground is littered with bodies as a skeleton army indiscriminately attacks people from all stations of life, pilgrims and peasants, a king and a cardinal, noblemen and ladies. No one is immune. At center, a grim reaper skeleton wielding a scathe and riding a starved horse whose visible ribs seem intent on plowing through the crowd. A slower moving wagon, driven by a pale, sickly horse, seems to be bringing up the rear guard and collecting the skulls of the deceased. This is a reminiscence of the death carts that collected bodies in plague-stricken communities. Church bells were rung as a warning when someone dies of the plague. And in this painting, two skeletons can be seen ringing a bell above the ruins of a church or catacomb, while another pair buries a coffin nearby. The painting includes several symbols denoting the transience of life. The skeleton supporting the king's body holds an hourglass in his hand, while the woman in red lying in the path of the dead wagon has a spindle. Both are traditional emblems of life's passage. Games of chance, cards, and backgammon lie knocked down to the ground. A young couple is about to be interrupted by yet another skeleton, as if to suggest that even love cannot win over death. Material objects, including the king's gold and the pilgrim's religious relics, are scattered about on the ground. Neither wealth nor religion has any purchase here. Bruegel's painting is part of a tradition of death-oriented subjects, produced in the wake of the Black Death. Most direct antecedents for the painting were Triumph of Death frescoes, produced in southern Italy, which also featured Death riding a skinny horse and attacking people of all social classes. In the 1446 fresco from the Palazzo Abbatellis in Palermo, which Bruegel likely saw during his trip to Italy, Death shoots arrows at its victims, which can be understood as a metaphor for the random and brutal nature of the Black Death. One can also see the influence of Hieronymus Bosch, who died 10 years before Bruegel was born, and whose work Bruegel copied and engraved in the early part of his career, while he worked for the printer Hieronymus Cook. Like Bosch, who was known for his eccentric, crowded compositions of tiny figures, Bruegel fills his canvas with so many figures that the eye does not know where to rest. The piles of dead are reminiscent of Boccacio's descriptions of the overwhelming abundance of plague victims in Florence. He recounted how the city's citizens dug for each graveyard a huge trench in which they laid the corpse as they arrived by hundreds at a time, piling them up tier upon tier as merchandise is stowed on a ship. Such imagery finds its visual analogy in Bruegel's nightmarish painting. Contextual analysis. The religious and social context for this work is integral to understanding its concerns. Bruegel's career took place in the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation, and the post-Reformation sensibility informs his depiction of human suffering. As mentioned, one can see references to Italian Triumph of Death frescoes in his work, but the image also partakes of the Northern European Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, tradition. The visual representation of the dance macabre dates back to a now lost French mural from the Holy Innocents Cemetery in Paris, painted in 1424, that depicts figures from all walks of life, from pauper to prince, parading their way to the grave. The movements of the skeleton's dance may have been symbolic of the involuntary movements of plague sufferers, as cell necrosis advanced prior to death. Throughout the 15th century, the motif was a popular subject for church and cemetery murals. Hans Holbein, the Younger, revived the late medieval allegory in a series of engravings called Dance of Death, published in 1526. The popularity of this subject speaks to concerns brought about by the persistent threat of sudden and painful death due to the plague. Bruegel's interpretation of this theme is much more contentious than typical dance macabre scenes in which the dead accept their mortality. Bruegel represents a scene of struggle and resistance rather than passive acceptance of the inevitability of death. Art historian Pieter describes this as an almost a war of extermination waged by the dead against the living. Thon sees this as a reference to the political situation in the Netherlands and the rising tensions between the Protestant Netherlands and the Catholic Spanish rule under the Habsburgs. This tension would lead to the 80 Years' War that began a few years after Bruegel's The Triumph of Death is thought to have been painted. However, it is also possible to see the war waged by the dead against the living in terms of the spread of the plague, in which caring for one's dying relatives could lead to one's own demise. Scholars generally interpret this surge in the type of death iconography as a manifestation of the trauma that people suffered during and in the aftermath of the clinical plague epidemics. Hans Holberg, the Younger, The Old Woman, Dance of Death, 1538. Selected work, Hjose Lienfrings, Saint Sebastian, interceding for the plague-stricken, 1497 to 99. Hjose Lienfrings, biography. Lienfrings was a South Netherlandish painter who was also active in France. His date and place of birth are unknown. Given his surname, it is possible that he was born in Lengferen, in present-day Belgium, though he was known to have lived in Hainaut, in the Diocese of Cambrai, which was then under the rule of the Duke of Burgundy. He was living in Provence by 1439 and was considered a member of the Provence School of Painters. In 1503, he married Michelle Chaugenet, who was the daughter of Jean Chaugenet of Avignon, a prominent French painter of that period. It is possible that Lienfrings studied with or refined his style under Chaugenet. He died in 1508, 5 years after his marriage. Subject matter and visual analysis. The subject of this painting is Saint Sebastian, a Christian martyr who lived during the Roman Empire. According to Catholic belief, he was an officer in the Roman military who rose to become commander of the Praetorian Guards. As a member of the Roman military, he worked to help imprison Christian martyrs until his own Christian faith was discovered by Emperor Diocletian, around 288 CE. Sebastian was tied to a post or a tree and shot with arrows by his own soldiers. According to legend, he managed to survive this incident because he was rescued and healed by Irene of Rome. Irene was the widow of another early Christian martyr, and she became a saint due to her care for Sebastian and her devotion to Christianity in the face of persecution. Sebastian tried to appeal directly to Diocletian, asking him to convert to Christianity and repent for his sins, and was subsequently clubbed to death and thrown into the Cloaca Maxima, an open canal that was Rome's early sewer system. Supposedly, Sebastian then appeared to Saint Lucia in a dream. He told her where to find his corpse so that he could receive a proper burial. He was subsequently buried in a catacomb on the Appian Way, not far from the basilica that bears his name. As a result of an anecdote that appeared in the Golden Legend, a medieval collection of biographies of saints, Saint Sebastian was prayed to for protection against the plague. This source described a great plague that afflicted the Lordbars of the 7th century. Apparently, a villager had a vision that the town should honor Saint Sebastian. In compliance with this vision, the townspeople erected an altar in honor of Sebastian in the Church of St. Peter of Pavia, Italy. As a result, the outbreak ended. Therefore, Saint Sebastian was known as a protector from plague. The painting seen in your art reproductions booklet is one panel of a multi-panel altarpiece depicting different scenes from the life of Saint Sebastian. Many Renaissance altarpieces have been taken apart and removed from their original locations in churches, as their individual panels can now be found in museums all over the world, including this panel from the Walters Gallery in Baltimore. The Altarpiece Panel shows Saint Sebastian in the heavens, pleading with God on behalf of the victims of the plague outbreak in 7th century Pavia, even though the event took place centuries after the saint's death. Saint Sebastian's iconography makes him easily identifiable in artworks. He is nearly always shown riddled with arrows to commemorate his initial victory over death and the sacrifices he made for his beliefs. During the Renaissance, Saint Sebastian was commonly shown wearing only a loincloth, emphasizing his healthy, muscular body. He remains undefeatable despite the arrows that puncture his skin, as exemplified Andrea Mantegna's Saint Sebastian of 1480. At a time when people were frightened about their own and the possibility of illness, Sebastian's healthy body was a symbol of hope. Depictions of Saint Sebastian's became popular during the Renaissance for largely two reasons. First, he was, as seen in this painting, a popular subject because of fears conquering the Black Death. He was known as a plague saint, someone who could intercede on your own behalf, and thus patrons who were concerned about the pandemic commissioned artworks featuring him. A second reason for his popularity was that while discoveries of Greek and Roman sculptures led artists to embrace their classical nude as represented in the sculptures of Apollo and Venus that they studied, religious commissioners rarely allowed them to paint such subjects. Saint Sebastian, who was stripped down to a loincloth before he was shot with arrows, was a notable exception. Featuring the saint as their subject matter allowed artists to showcase their naturalism and skill in painting the human figure. In Lefranc's painting, Saint Sebastian is shown kneeling before God and pleading for the plague-ridden town while an angel and a demon face off in the sky. The foreground shows a grave attendant closely at the fallen man. You can see a red bump on his neck. These swollen glands, called buboes, were a primary symptom of the bubonic plague. In the middle ground, two additional bodies can be seen awaiting their funerary rites. Mourners are presented on the left. One gestures towards the fallen man, while a woman raises her arms in an expression of distress. The repetition of bodies wrapped in a white cloth and growing smaller as they recede into the distance, demonstrating the artist's awareness of the principles of spatial recession, leads to the eye of the death cart in the background, which is laden with still more bodies. It is being pulled through the city streets by a pale horse. The clothing of the clergy on mourners does not reflect the 7th century, the period of plague that was being commemorated. Instead, they wear contemporary dress, implying that the problems of the past are still present. Indeed, the reason this painting was commissioned for a church in Marseille was due to fears that a recent outbreak of plague nearby would spread to the city. The association of the plague with images of bodies riddled with arrows predates this painting of Saint Sebastian. A 14th century fresco in a French abbey depicted the plague as being personified by a faceless woman with a black hood, clutching arrows in each hand. She is flanked on either side by her victims, people felled by arrows. Many are pierced in the neck and armpits, representing the places where plague sufferers were often afflicted with pustules and buboes, swollen glands. The idea that epidemics were unleashed on the earth by a spray of arrows dates back to the Iliad, which features the incident where Apollo, angered by Agamemnon's disrespect, unleashes plague-bearing arrows upon the Greeks for 9 days. Saint Sebastian, who survived an arrow attack, thus became a fitting patron saint for the plague-stricken.